All right, so welcome to the third and final panel of this terrific conference. My name is Oren Bar-Gill. Just in way of very brief introduction, this is a panel about algorithms. What can be more exciting than algorithms? Algorithms are used extensively in consumer markets and beyond. They're used for targeting and customization, often to substantial benefit of consumers. But algorithms can also cause harm. They can be harmful. They might generate biased outcomes intentionally or unintentionally. They might facilitate harmful collusion and price discrimination, and they might distort information, beliefs, and even political outcomes. And so the question then becomes, for policymakers in particular, what do we do? How can we minimize or address the harms, the potential costs of algorithms without undermining the great benefits that they can provide? So these are some of the issues that our distinguished speakers are going to discuss in this panel. And let me introduce them briefly, and then I'll sit down and shut up. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Maurice Stucke. Professor Stucke teaches at the University of Tennessee. He has served in various important government positions as Special Assistant U.S. Attorney and in the Antitrust Division of the United States Department of Justice. He is a co-author of two important recent books, Big Data and Competition Policy from OUP and Virtual Competition from Harvard University Press. His scholarship is widely cited by courts and regulators in the US and beyond the US, in many other countries and international bodies. Professor Stucke serves as a senior fellow at the American Antitrust Institute on the advisory boards of the Academic Society for Competition Law and the Institute for Consumer Antitrust Studies. He has received many awards for his scholarship, which I will not enumerate in order to save us time. Our second distinguished speaker is Professor Catherine Tucker. She is the Sloan Distinguished Professor of Management Science and Professor of Marketing at MIT. Most of her research lies in the interface between marketing, economics, and law. She is a world-renowned expert in online advertising, digital health, social media, and electronic privacy. Her list of publication is long, very long, and her papers are published in the most distinguished and prestigious peer-reviewed journals. She's co-editor of Quantitative Marketing and Economics and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And again, the list of awards that Professor Tucker has received for her work is too long to recite here. I will end now and give the floor to Professor Stucke, our first presenter.
Thanks. So, vielen Dank. Many thanks for the invitation. As Oren mentioned, we co-authored two books, and in both books we look at the benefits of a data-driven economy as well as an economy that's increasingly influenced by algorithms. And we also look at some of the potential risks, and some of the risks that we identify first are algorithmic tacit collusion. Second is behavioral discrimination. And then the third are abuses by the dominant super platforms. And one of the important things that I want to mention today is that the harm from these super platforms may not necessarily be just economic, but they could also affect our privacy, our well-being, as well as our democracy. And we foresee some of these concerns with the rise of the digital personal assistant. So one Wall Street analyst said it very nicely. He said, apps are worth millions, but platforms are worth billions. And today, what you see are four of the super platforms that are dominating the data-driven economy. And if you hadn't picked it up yet, there was a recent, the May 6th, May 12th Economist does several nice articles on this. And how does this relate then to the digital personal assistant? Well, you've already seen now advertisements for them. Google has one, Amazon as well as offering one. And demand for these digital personal assistants is now booming. Amazon reported in its annual report that its Alexa-enabled device was the top-selling product across all categories on Amazon.com during the past Christmas season. And it's forecasted that 35.6 million people in the United States will use one of these digital assistants in 2017, up 129% from 2016 levels. And there's also been recent press reports about Apple improving Siri, as well as Facebook going to be launching its digital assistant, M. And these digital assistants can offer significant benefits. One of them is the transition from a world where we're going to be typing on our computers to voice. And then the other is that as the artificial intelligence develops, these digital assistants will no longer be responding to our requests, but they could conceivably be anticipating our needs and fulfilling them as well. And the leading platforms basically envision, there's this great quote, a future where humans do less thinking when it comes to the small decisions that make up daily life. So the more that we rely on the digital assistant, the less likely we may be searching online, the less likely we may use price comparison websites or download apps. And the other thing is that it's unlikely that we want to have 4 digital butlers in our house asking us, what movie would you like to watch tonight, or what restaurant from which you'd like to order. So each of the super platforms are now vying to become the head butler to primarily undertake our tasks and make decisions for us. So then that leads you to ask, what are the implications if we have 1 or 2 leading digital butlers? Who will likely become our head butler, and what are the stakes? So one thing that comes up is network effects, and you've heard about it in the first 2 panels. And one of the implications here with these digital butlers is that the stakes can be so large because you have multiple network effects that come into play. And one thing that, a theme that you heard from the prior 2 panels is that network effects are not necessarily bad. You may not necessarily leverage them across markets, but in some markets, these network effects can increase entry barriers. They can also increase our switching costs. And more importantly, these network effects can also affect the quality of the product itself, and that can have significant implications. So with these digital butlers, we see at least 4 potential network effects at play. The first is what's called the traditional indirect network effects. And this is something that you might have seen already with the European Commission's case against Microsoft, as well as the DOJ's case against Microsoft. And here, the more popular that Alexa becomes, that's Amazon's digital assistant, the more likely then manufacturers are going to then seek to have their smart appliances connect with Alexa. And the more that app developers are going to develop skills for Alexa, like ordering pizza from Domino's. And so here you could see then as one digital butler starts taking the lead, it will then acquire more skills, more smart devices will be able to connect with it. And the quality of that digital butler can then be superior than to alternative butlers. And so you're already starting to see this race between Amazon and Google as to lining up manufacturers to connect their smart products with them. Google announced very recently that it had already 70 smart home partners supporting its Google Assistant, and this includes GE Appliances, LG Electronics, Whirlpool, and other household manufacturers. The second network effect is what we call learning by doing. And one example of this would be search engines. Now you might think, how is a search engine a network effect? How does my utility increase when someone else uses the same search engine? But what you see here is as more people use a particular search engine, the algorithm then can be trained to better predict then responsive results, and then it has the opportunity to learn through trial and error. And then it becomes a better search engine as a result, ergo attracting more users, and then it continues. Now, at some point, it tapers off. Where that exactly is, no one has yet really determined. The third network effect involves the scope of data. And here, it's a different type of network effect. It's more getting the variety of data about you so it can predict your particular tastes and anticipate your particular needs. So, for example, when you're using Alexa, where were you searching? Where is your current location? What's your browser history? What are your particular tastes? And then that can refine it so that the personal assistant can better anticipate your unique needs and provide you then with personalized products and services. And then the fourth network effect is what we've heard already this morning, and this involves on the paid side. And here we can conceivably have two sets on the pay side. One of them will be sellers of products and services like Amazon. The other will involve advertisers. And here you can see that the more the digital butler learns about you, the better it can predict what products and services to offer you. Also, what behavioral ads you're more likely to click. And then the better it can become, the more likely it can attract others on the paid side. And the important thing here is that the digital butler may become just one avenue for the super platform. That it's going to collect data about you through its digital butler, but then use that data to target you across its platform, let's say in emails, search results, driverless cars, even on the smart technologies themselves. And so what you can see here then is how these four network effects can feed off one another, and that the more data that the digital butler collects about you, the more likely it can offer you then products and services, more likely it will attract then manufacturers, more likely that you'll click the ad, the more revenue it has, the more it could expand its platform. So one thing that my co-author, Ariel Izraki, and I predict is that it's unlikely we're going to have, let's say, 5 or 6 digital butlers in the future. I think it's hard to predict these markets, but our best prediction would be that we'll likely have 1 or 2 leading digital butlers. And then what are the potential risks if we then have 1 or 2 leading potential, 1 or 2 digital assistants? And I mean, some of them were already touched on the prior speech. And the Germans are no doubt familiar with Kyla and Stasi Bobby, right? So you have here this concern about privacy as a fundamental value when you have this one entity that controls so much information about you. And there was this really interesting case that came up in the United States. There was a person who was found dead in a hot tub in Arkansas. And the police came into the person's house and they found the Amazon Echo device in the house. Most of the data is stored with Amazon itself, so the police then subpoenaed Amazon for the data. And Amazon responded that the state could just not get that data. What Amazon had argued is that in order to turn over that data, the state government had to satisfy a heightened burden. Specifically, Amazon had to argue that the state had to show 2 things. First, a compelling need for the information sought, including that it's not available from other sources. And second, a sufficient nexus between the information and the subject of the criminal investigation. And what's telling is that Amazon here told the court that the data it collects raises significant privacy concerns. It told the court that with access to the data, one can reconstruct the sum of an individual's private life. And that's true. I mean, just imagine, you think about Stasi Barbie. Here you're going to have a device in the home that's going to collect information from all the family members, conceivably. So what happened in that case? Well, eventually the defendant agreed to have the data turned over to the police, and Amazon did so. But the case is really a harbinger of things to come, that this is going to be an issue that the courts will have to grapple with. It also raises concerns about covert surveillance by governments, that governments may illegally hack into our digital butlers, and what are the privacy implications with that? And then it also raises the concerns about any one company having so much data about an individual. But besides these privacy concerns, and let me just, one thing that came up earlier in the panel is like, well, how is privacy a competition issue? And I think one remarkable thing is to see the European Commission evolution on this. And I think now most competition officials would recognize that privacy protection can be an important non-price component of competition. And we saw that in the Microsoft LinkedIn decision. But besides these privacy concerns, there are also economic concerns about potential abuse. That by having this digital butler, that can increase the market power of the super platform, and they could use that power anti-competitively, either upstream or downstream. And so we recently had an article about some potential anti-competitive effects upstream on sellers. And one concern is that the super platform can now charge sellers an access fee in order to have their digital butler promote their products or services. The other thing is what happens when the super platform vertically integrates and starts competing against some of these sellers. Then its interests may not necessarily be aligned with consumers because it might favor its own products or services. There also can be adverse downstream effects, and one of the things that we identify is behavioral discrimination. And this differs from price discrimination in three respects. First, we're moving from third-degree price discrimination to first-degree price discrimination. So a better approximation about how much you're willing to pay. Second is moving the demand curve to the right. It's getting you to buy things that ordinarily you might not wanted to have buy in the first place at the maximum price. And third is the durability of this price discrimination. But the economic power can also translate to political power. So this is not only going to potentially affect what you buy, this could affect the political debate as well as our views. Because people are increasingly relying now on these super platforms for the news that they receive and the entertainment that they get. And the more that we rely on the digital butler, the more the super platform has the power to shape our political and social views as well as our behavior, because it knows our biases, it knows our leanings and the like. So Facebook, for example, doesn't just passively collect data about us. Facebook also has the power to affect our behavior. And there was this one interesting study, the emotional contagion study that you may be familiar with, where what Facebook did was it shifted its algorithm so that for some users they got more positive news feeds, and for other users they got more negative news feeds. And they wanted to see if that affected the user's behavior, and it did. The ones who got more positive feeds were themselves more positive in their postings. The one with more negative had more negative news feeds. So what then are the political and social implications when you have the digital butler suggesting replies to your emails and having what news you obtain and the like? So I leave you then with 4 thoughts. First, we can't necessarily assume that market forces will deliver to us a virtual digital assistant, one who will always be aligned with our interest. Nor can we assume that market forces will curb any abuses by the super platforms. That market forces, given that these data-driven network effects that I identified, have the potential to increase our switching costs, increase entry barriers, and lessen the ability of smaller platforms to compete effectively in this space. Second, the popularity of these digital assistants have significant implications beyond what antitrust officials traditionally looked at, price competition. They have economic concerns as well as social and political concerns when you have power concentrated in fewer hands. And you're starting to see in the United States this really interesting development, beginning with even before it, but recently at the University of Chicago, they had a very important conference, and then just last week at Oxford University that was written up in the Financial Times. And one thing that you're starting to get from these conferences, including with panels with enforcement makers, is what's the political content of antitrust, particularly as we're shifting to this digital economy. And then the third significant issue is what are we going to do about it? Are our competition, consumer protection, and privacy officials up to the task? And then finally, what is the ultimate aim for our data-driven economy? And one thing that Christian spoke this morning, they're doing some wonderful things at the EDPS to promote greater coordination among the privacy, consumer protection, and competition officials. But what we posit is that any data-driven economy should achieve several things. First, it should be inclusive. It should promote the welfare of more than 1% of the economy. Second, it should protect citizens' privacy interests, given that privacy in countries is a fundamental right. Third, it should promote citizens' overall well-being. And finally, it should promote a healthy democracy and a healthy marketplace of ideas. So I'm very much interested in getting your response, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, so thank you for still being here at 5 o'clock, and thank you for letting me speak. I'm going to be talking about a very particular study, and it's going to help illuminate issues of bias. But I thought because it was 5 o'clock, I should just give you a little bit of a plan for today, so you know when to snooze off. So if you're speaking of yourself as more of a consumer protection, data privacy person, stay awake for the first bit. And then just at the end, for those of you who are more in sort of competition, thinking about cartels, then I'm going to think a little bit more about those. So, as I say, when it comes, I've got a very specific research paper I want to present, and there's going to be a simple question, and the question is, why might it be that an ad-serving algorithm appears biased in a way which sort of goes against all the sort of aims you might think of in terms of inclusion for the digital economy? Now, why did I do this? Well, I did this because I was recently attending an FTC privacy conference, and I noticed there was a big shift in the privacy debate. So for the sort of like 2005, 2015, what would happen is that lawyers would say we want to protect privacy, it's a fundamental right. Economists would stand on the stage and say, show me the harm. And we did that for 10 years. And since then, I think the debate's moved on, and the debate's now trying to think, well, actually, what kind of privacy harms can we document? And that's particularly powerful, I think, in a context where you don't necessarily have an enshrined right to privacy. And an obvious potential privacy harm of our world of data is algorithmic bias. And as a result, several papers have become much talked about in the policy debate, and they're done by computer scientists, and what they've done is they've documented instances of an algorithm appearing biased. So, for example, Sweeney shows that if you do a Google search using an African American name, you're more likely to see an ad for a criminal background check. Now, these papers have had a huge influence on policy, but they haven't really investigated why it happens. They show it happens, but the question is not why the algorithm's biased. And this paper is really intended to try and think why it is that algorithms sometimes behave in ways that we might think of as biased. So I have an example here, right? This is LinkedIn. If you try and search for Stephanie Williams, the algorithm thinks, no, who would ever look for a woman on an employment site? You must have been Stephen, right? Now, the question is why does the algorithm do this? So there's sort of like, various theories. The first sort of first theory, well, maybe the people who write the algorithms are biased. We notice there's a lot of white guys in tech. Maybe that's what's going on. I don't know if that's, that passes much muster. The second, I think more nuanced idea is that the reason that this might happen on LinkedIn is that in some sense we have to use data to train an algorithm, and if for whatever reason females have left the workplace and as a result there are more Stephens out there than Stephanies, then that could explain what we're seeing. Or it could be that the algorithm's not self-neutral and it just learns behavior from humans behaving in a certain way over time. So those are the sort of ideas that we have out there where algorithms may be biased. I'm going to actually say that even maybe more complicated than these theories. And what I'm going to present is a field test where we show an ad for job opportunities in science, technology, and engineering in 190 countries. Why science, technology, and engineering? Well, this has traditionally been a field where, across both the US and Europe, we've wanted to attract more women. And indeed, this website was designed to try and encourage people to enter the STEM field. And we purposely set it up as gender neutral. And am I jumping around too much? Oh. Sorry. Well, this will be great. Okay, so now you're going to actually hear what I'm saying. So, I was telling you about this study. We've got a test of this ad across 190 countries. And I'm going to posit this mystery that this ad gets shown to more men than women, right? That's going to be the mystery. Now, the background for this ad is going to be quite interesting in that it's actually been one of my most satisfying research enterprises in that I set it up with a group of over 30 undergraduates. And usually when you're a management professor, I try and get undergraduates excited about research. They're not, right? That's not sexy. But this was like the one issue which really excited them. And I want to give them a lot of credit for this. Now, the reason I think this matters for this audience is that this, as I say, what we're going to try and do is, like, given that this ad will be shown to more men than women, we're going to try and work out why. And I'm going to present an argument that algorithmic transparency is not necessarily going to help us in this case. And this is important because we heard this theme this morning that maybe if we're more transparent, that's a common and appropriate policy approach for many instances. But I'm going to argue that in this case, even if you had full algorithmic transparency, it wouldn't help you predict the kind of bias that we're going to see. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about this test. So we're going to show this test. The test was, as I say, designed by a pool of 30 undergraduate students who were passionate about this topic of trying to promote STEM careers. We launched this ad on a major social network in 190 countries. Now, I say it's a field test. It's not a fancy field experiment. Instead, all that's really happening is that we're going to show it in 190 countries. And we're going to make sure that in each country, the ad was shown to at least 5,000 people. That becomes a challenge in Vatican City, right? But usually that's going to be easy to do. Now, we are going to target it at a general population. We want to get information out here. And so we're going to vary the country. And we're going to make it, and this is important, explicitly gender neutral. We're going to say, an algorithm, we don't care about gender. We want it to be shown to all people. Now, what's nice about this paper on Thursday afternoon is that it actually doesn't need much complex analysis. In that you're going to be able to see all the major results in a summary statistics table. Now, there's a little bit of MIT here because I think it's far past 5 p.m. and I'm showing you lots of data. So let me just walk you through what we find. So what we find, you're going to see some columns there. We're going to use a bit of advertising speak. We're dividing it up by age and by gender. The first two columns are going to be how many times people see the ads. Remember, we asked the algorithm to make this ad gender neutral. What we're going to see, though, is that on average, men are going to see it more. And I want you to see that they see it more in particular between the ages of 25 and 45, basically. However, if you look at the clicks, the story's actually a bit better, right? It starts to look more equal. So those are going to be the big main empirical regularities in that men are going to see the ad more, particularly if you compare young men and young women. But on the whole, the clicks are going to be similar. So let's going to talk through these ads and what they mean. So what we want to do is explain why this happened. As you saw, I've got a lot of ads being shown to a lot of people. This doesn't seem to be just like an accident. I didn't show the ad enough times. So let's try and work out why this happened. Okay, so one potential explanation is simply there are fewer women out there on social media. Luckily, people have spent a long time watching how women use social media compared to men, and women spend a lot more time on social media on average. So that's not the explanation. What we are interested in, actually one of the reasons we went to 190 countries, is we had in mind this story that perhaps the algorithm could pick up the bias of the country, right? That was the sort of story that we've heard before, that there's a training set, the algorithm becomes biased because it learns from cultural prejudice. And so we actually looked for this, and we got some World Health Organization data, and we used this to try and isolate out countries which have, should we say, better and worse rights records for females in terms of, say, educational participation, voting rights, and so on. And what we found was absolutely nothing, right? It was like the least significant set of statistical results you've ever seen. None of the cultural prejudice of the country seemed to matter. Indeed, when you actually plotted out the data, what was clear is that the countries that were really driving this effect were the rich countries, right? And in general, the richer countries tend to have a better record on female and male equality. Okay, so that's not going on. So then we finally worked out what was going on, right? So it wasn't that the algorithm picked up bias from the country. Instead, what had happened was that the algorithm was just being efficient. And it was picking up the fact that male eyeballs are cheaper than female eyeballs. And as a consequence, if you're trying to cost minimize, and you're trying to think how to allocate advertising, they're going to show ads to men rather than women because they're cheaper. In other words, there's something we might think of as competitive spillovers, that all the advertisers who are targeting females are bidding up the price of female eyeballs, and as a result, displacing ads which are intended to be gender neutral. And so to support this, we sent out my poor 30 undergraduate students to manually collect data from all these countries on advertising rates, and that's exactly what we saw in the data. That there's a big premium for female eyeballs between the ages of about 25 and 40. You might think of this as perhaps times when women have babies. If you've ever had a baby, you know you spend a lot of money. Right, we're going to grab that opportunity. And also, there's a whole, it could well be rational because of the whole literature and marketing out there about how females control many household purchases. So it seems to be perhaps rational bidding up behavior, but this behavior by other advertisers can lead the algorithm to appear biased against females, and in some sense preclude females from having the opportunities to see the same information as men. Now, so that's what we found. And in some sense, there's a lot of limitations. It's a single field test. It's a descriptive paper. I think a big limit, in some sense, we look at gender. We look at gender in STEM ads because that's being a big issue about getting women into STEM careers. I want to say that as well as being a limitation, it also makes me worry a bit more broadly about what is going on. Because I can measure how many women and men are seeing these ads because the social media platform tells me. However, there may be all kinds of other bias going on in the algorithm to do with your social class, your income background, your race, that because I'm not told explicitly about that, I don't know that's going on, right? So this is troubling, but what I'm not able to measure, maybe even sort of more troubling. Another question I want to bring up, and I know I've got a lot of lawyers in the room, is that I started off telling you I was going to talk about algorithmic bias. But is this bias, right? What I'm actually picking up is not an algorithm intending to discriminate against women. Instead, you have an algorithm trying to profit maximize and ending up with an outcome that appears biased because of other advertising decisions. All right. So just to summarize the study, this was a paper where we ran a huge set of tests to try and understand the extent of algorithm bias in the serving of an ad about employment opportunities in math, engineering, and technology. Now, we show that the obvious explanations for this are not true. Whenever I play the guessing game, you meet someone, you describe your research, and I ask someone why they think this happens, they usually think it's self-inflicted. They usually think that the reason that these ads aren't shown to women is because they don't click on them. But that's not what happens. If women ever see the ads, they're more likely to click on men. They just don't see them. It's not to do with the algorithm picking up local prejudice. Instead, what it is simply a result of competitive spillovers and the algorithm reacting to the fact that some advertisers prioritize women, meaning that they are more expensive to show ads to. So what this means is that apparent algorithmic bias may just be an unintentional consequence of external behavior. And I would like to argue that makes it almost harder, right? So we started off with 3 potential explanations of algorithmic bias, which is white guys, training data sets, people's behavior. But what I want you to know about this kind of algorithmic bias is that unless I ran this study, it wasn't going to be predictable. And even if we made the algorithm completely transparent, it wouldn't be obvious that this was going to happen. So, if we're sort of thinking about why this is important, the nice thing is if you're a marketing manager, there's an obvious thing to do. Don't assume your algorithm will be gender neutral, age neutral, or neutral to race, or anything else you may care about. Instead, you're going to have to force it to do what you want to do. When it comes to policy, though, I think the big point is to just say that algorithmic transparency, though an attractive slogan or banner, wouldn't have actually helped us here. And so therefore, it may be the case that when we're thinking about policy approaches towards algorithms, we're going to have to go a little bit further, thinking about maybe algorithmic auditing or other approaches. So with that, I think we should have some questions from the floor.
So before we open this to the floor, I want to take my kind of moderator's prerogative and ask kind of one question, and I have a version of it for both of our speakers. And the question is basically the question that Catherine ended with is, so what should regulators do about this? And so Catherine, you said that transparency is not going to work. And you mentioned something about algorithmic auditing. So if you could tell us a little bit more of how do you think that would kind of play out and what regulators should do according to your analysis. And then I'm going to kind of ask Maurice basically the same question. And so you mentioned that you teed this up and saying that there is a problem and regulators need to deal with this and kind of the various problems and issues that you identified. But what exactly do you think are the main and most potent and effective levers for policymakers to use? So Catherine, if you could start.
Okay. So, I brought up the issue of algorithmic transparency, and, I'm perhaps being a little bit unfair because it's a little bit of a straw man, in that if you ever mention algorithmic transparency in front of computer scientists, they fall on the floor laughing at the idea it's ever possible, right? They just don't think it's even viable. So I'm not even sure if I'm critiquing a viable policy, but assuming it was, viable, I think my paper shows it's probably not enough. So what's the answer? Well, one answer is for potentially authorities to run studies like mine to try and understand what the outcomes of algorithms are. Now, it's possible to automate it. It may be the case you don't have to inspire 30 young kids to be constantly monitoring it. But it seems that we need to focus more on the outcomes of algorithms rather than necessarily a policy approach of, I think, digging in the technical weeds, which may not be that helpful.
And after I'm sorry, I just have to follow up. And after we've done your study, after you've done your study, and we know what's going on, what then? What should they do? Should they force them to pay more? Should they intervene in some way to reduce the price of female eyeballs?
Okay, so this is really interesting. So I've talked to both people at the social media platform and managers who run these campaigns. And generally in the social media platform, they're like, oh, yes, of course, now I think about it, of course that's going to happen, right? So I don't know what that means, right? But it just means that when you tell them about it, it's obvious, but it's not. They're not obviously doing this for intent right now. Right. Managers, right, this is just a new thing. They don't necessarily understand how algorithms are going to affect the quality or distribution of their ads. And, once you educate them, they're like, oh, that's in it. They like it because usually academics say stuff and then it's difficult to do. Mine is very easy to do, right? This is an easy fix.
So one thing that we've come to the conclusion is that there's not a silver bullet, that it's really going to depend on the particular anti-competitive problem. So one of the areas that we look at is tacit algorithmic collusion, and there the policy response is likely going to be different than, let's say, abuses by a super platform or behavioral discrimination. And even looking at this behavioral discrimination, one thing that we consider is, do you go with an ex post approach? And one of the things you've already heard is how slow it often is to go after these anti-competitive practices. So by the time that the agency actually brings the case and seeks a remedy, it may be too late. So the other thing that we're looking at then is, what are the necessary preconditions to have effective privacy competition? What are sort of the scaffolding that should be in the economy that could promote this form of competition? And I know that the UK, the CMA, is looking at this precise issue, as well as the European Commission. And one of the things is data portability, and then the other is the ability to have data lockers so that you have the data, you can then decide who gets that data, and does that help then lower your switching costs as well as to lower entry barriers. So the bottom line that we're finding, and we agree, is like with transparency, that there's not a silver bullet. Transparency is not always going to uncover, like with our tacit collusion scenarios, what's going on. And what it really requires is coordination among various competition, privacy, consumer protection officials, both looking at it ex ante as well as ex post.
And questions from the audience? Please.
Thanks a lot for the interesting talks. I have a short question, or two short questions to Catherine. First of all, I didn't fully understand, so I guess you had a commercial firm doing the ad thing for you, like, or is that right? So that's how you got it to the websites. That's the first thing. And the other question is, I know that when Google places ads, you can select a lot of things. So you don't want your ad to appear on the website of the Communist Party, for example, when someone Googles that. So you have a lot of options, and they think a great deal about how to market their advertising services to firms and which options to give to them. So in your case, do I understand correctly that you could have chosen, you want the same number of women and men to see the ad, right? And that would have then worked probably, but this is mainly an understanding.
Oh yes, so no, I skirted through the details. So this is basically what my wonderful undergraduates did, was they found a partner site to help who wanted us to advertise for them, and then we simply ran the advertising campaign for them on a very, very large social network. So we're using, if you think about how a lot of advertising is delivered today, we're using precisely that algorithm. Like, we don't have our own algorithm, we're using a standard advertising platform. In terms of the question about extra targeting options, one thing which is interesting is we tried doing a target where we looked at people who are engineers, which you might think is an obvious thing to do. If you do that, it actually gets shown to even more men than women. And why is that? Well, rich women are even harder to find, right? So the ad algorithm goes into hyperdrive at that point. So sometimes it can help, sometimes it can hurt.
Other questions? In the back?
My question is also to Catherine, and this is, or from looking at the raw data, it seemed to me that on average the women clicked more on the ad. So is this because they on average usually have a bit better click-through rate, or are they usually better, or does it mean that because they were women and it was more costly to target women anyway, that they are better matched?
Oh, interesting question. So in general, women always click more on ads, right? Whether it's, well, maybe not for, I don't know, give me a male product, golf clubs, but on most other products, and now I've just offended all the female golfers in the room, but in general, like you look at any like wide-ranging household goods or consumer products, women click more. Now, what's interesting is if I compare click-through rates for the average product, they were actually our increment for females clicking was really actually higher, right? So women, if they saw the ad, were more interested in this ad than they were on shoes, the shoe ads, which they generally see, but they just didn't have the opportunity to see the ad.
Other questions? I'll ask another one, though. So while you get your questions ready for the next round. So I want to, and this was alluded to, I think, by both of you, and maybe specifically, Catherine, when you were talking about the computer scientists laughing at you when you mentioned transparency. And I imagine one of the reasons they were doing that is because of the kind of rapid increase of artificial intelligence and deep learning and the way the algorithms work. And the reason why this makes transparency laughable is because nobody really knows what the algorithm is doing. So the programmers of the algorithms don't know. And so my question is, how does this make life harder, both for, for businesses who are trying to figure out exactly how they're, targeting the audience and what, figure out what their algorithm is doing, and then, and maybe to Maurice, how does this make life harder for regulators? Now, one approach that maybe you are alluding to, Catherine, is that even if we don't know in advance, because it's all deep learning, we can ex post try to conduct these types of studies and try to reverse engineer what's going on. Just one kind of tidbit that I've heard, another area that I'm working in which this is a problem is consumer credit and credit ratings for consumers. And it's really, now that the rating agencies are also using these types of algorithms and they sometimes don't really know. We have all these kind of new upstart types of algorithms for credit ratings that use all these kind of deep learning type algorithms to figure out who is a better credit risk or not. And this might be a big challenge for regulators, and this is a space where regulators are very active. And so one thing that I've heard is some of these new kind of credit ratings agencies or startups, or even the old ones who are now using this new technology, they're trying to do this kind of backwards engineering and trying to show regulators, well, these are the things that are important for our kind of secret deep learning algorithm when we're doing it. So what do we do with these non-transparent deep learning algorithms?
So, when I hear laughter, I think there's two reasons. First of all, because if you think of most major tech firms, their code is just all over the place in a way which you can't even imagine the size and scope of this code, so they don't even know how it's viable. The other thing I should probably mention is the people who start laughing, but maybe sort of very darkly laughing, tend to be their lawyers, right? Because this is their crown jewels, right? And you're saying, I'm going to put all the stuff which I've spent so much money and time developing out there. So that's why I tend to hear laughter, but maybe you've had other kinds of laughter.
Yeah, we address this issue with collusion. And so one simple scenarios where competitors agree to collude, and then they use the algorithm to help perfect their cartel. And so there was a recent case involving Tompkins. He was selling posters on Amazon, and there was his co-conspirators. And that's a no-brainer for competition officials because the illegality inheres in the agreement. The second scenario, and this came up a little bit with the panel with Uber, is what happens when you have this entity that sets the price for multiple competitors. And that's not necessarily going to be a problem, but what happens then once the market power of the hub increases? To what extent does that then resemble a hub and spoke conspiracy? So as Uber increases in market power, drivers might now join that platform knowing that no other driver can undercut it on price. So you have a series of vertical agreements. Does that now start resembling a hub and spoke conspiracy? The third scenario is a little bit more problematic. Here, each company unilaterally decides to use its own pricing algorithm, but they do so with anti-competitive intent. So the Wall Street Journal had this recent article about gasoline stations here in Europe and how they were using these algorithms to help avoid a price war and increase profits. So here you have evidence of anti-competitive intent, but no agreement. Is that sufficient? And then the final is the most problematic, and this is what you're alluding to, is here you have no evidence of anti-competitive intent, no evidence of an anti-competitive agreement. It's in this environment, because of the increased transparency and machine learning, the algorithms themselves then arrive at the tacit collusion equilibrium. And so that raises these really fundamental issues as to what extent are humans then liable for the behavior of the algorithm. And this is not only going to affect collusion, this is driverless cars and the like. And that is still unresolved. I mean, that's now being debated.
Tommaso.
So I have a question to Maurice. So you said at the end of your talk, are consumer and competition authority up to the task, especially mentioning that above all these problems that we are discussing now, so what if the algorithm alone goes in a place that we would not like to, but there are all these dimensions that go behind competition and consumer issues. So you mentioned political power, so we had this discussion this morning again. So my question is, are they up to the task as two dimensions? One, can they understand these things? So if even tech companies don't understand their code, how can we expect that authority can do that? And which kind of resources they would need to do that? But more fundamentally, and that is a discussion in competition policy for many years, is so what is the goal? What is the aim of competition policy? So generally we focus on consumer welfare, and then other economists outside our small profession say, well, but there are many other objective that policymakers want to reach, right? So now, if we have this issue that the ownership of data has huge implication, social implication, political implication, so who should take care of that? Should the authority do that? Should be that the authority just focus on the economic or competition or consumer issues, and then politics is taking care of the other issues? So how is your view on this?
Yeah, this is the live issue right now. So it used to be, in the past 35 years, what United States has migrated to was a price-centric antitrust analysis, where what was measurable was important. And I think one interesting thing that Hayek said when he got the Nobel Prize is that in economics, what's measurable isn't always necessarily what's important. And you're seeing this particularly with these multi-sided platforms where one side is free, that consumers aren't necessarily going to face an increase in price post-merger, but there could be other parameters of competition, including innovation and quality and privacy protection, that could be adversely affected. So you have, on one hand, the antitrust agency migrating towards its price-centric tools, and what they've done is they've ignored at times the free side of the platform. And one of the things that we've pointed out is that that's not valid going forward in the data-driven economy. I think the OECD, most economists agree that you can't just assess a merger's effect on one side of the platform and not consider its impact on the other. And this came to in radio mergers, where the DOJ just looked at the effect on advertising rates and not on the listenership side. And then once they had retrospectives that came out, it showed that the DOJ got it wrong, both on advertising rates as well as quality on listenership. So that's one important thing, is that the price-centric antitrust analysis is not going to be feasible in this data-driven economy, that you have to consider other parameters of competition, such as privacy protection, quality, innovation, and the like. The second thing that is really important is that the stakes here are significantly higher, because we're not just talking about the price that you're going to likely pay, because these gatekeepers, given the information that's processed through them, the news and entertainment, there could be other profound effects. So now, will the antitrust enforcers' analysis be incomplete if they only look, for example, on price effects on advertisers and not consider this other dimension? Now, we can have a discussion as whether or not the competition official is the best person to deal with that. Might there be another agency, like a telecom agency, that looks at it? But one problem is that, and this was before, and I think the European Commission is changing significantly, is that when Christian organized the first EDPS event, there was sort of like, this is not our problem, the competition officials, right? This is a privacy issue. I don't even know why we're here. But that attitude has changed significantly over the last 3 years. And I think now that the recognition is that you just can't ignore these effects, because we focused a lot on false positives, but we haven't really focused on false negatives. And I think what you see here in The Economist and the like is that over the past 35 years in the United States, there's now starting to be questioning about whether or not our light antitrust analysis worked with respect to price effects, but also, has it worked generally? I mean, you're seeing markets increasingly concentrated, profits accruing to a handful of firms, less mobility, fewer startups, and the like. Now, there's some debate, because each of these studies may have its flaws, but one of the things that came out at the Chicago conference is that they're all sort of pointing in the same direction. So those are the issues that you raise are right now the issues that the competition officials are grappling with.
In the morning when we discussed platform competition, Michael Bay told us, I think quite convincingly, how these platforms expand our reach and facilitate transactions that would never happen if we just had always stayed in our village and shopped at the shop that is there, and would have never known that someplace far away there is somebody who has a product that exactly fits our needs. What you just said about these personal assistants seem to suggest that rather the opposite will happen with these gadgets, because if the offers that I receive and the goods and services that enter my radar are pre-selected by some appliance that records the history that I have developed, I will always move in the same direction and sort of reinforce the prejudices and the predilections that I have. I think in news, that is already a topic that's being discussed, that there are the general networks and newspapers are kind of disappearing. People join news groups and they have only fed a certain perspective on the world, and sort of get to more and more extreme conclusions. And so if I imagined if I develop a taste for pizza in a certain period of my life and I have this personal assistant, I will sort of end up eating pizzas until the very end, because I will receive no other offers. I will never learn that there are Chinese and Mexican restaurants. That is an extreme example, I know, but I could imagine that this would, developing offers only on the basis of what you've had before excludes 99% of the world. And I wonder whether first consumers will really like that you are sort of personalized, you get a personalized view of the world also with regard to products, services, entertainment, whatever. That's one issue, whether at a certain point in time consumers will just ignore or reject these offers and develop different tastes for other electronic products, or if that doesn't happen, would it not create a very unidimensional world of goods and services? Might not that be a public policy or a competition problem that those who are already there, who have already influenced the tastes of people, get stronger and stronger, much more so than in the past, whereas new entries become ever more difficult, not in the electronic sector, but in other sectors, in restaurants, or any goods and services. Isn't that an overarching problem?
Right. I mean, so that's precisely. So we're showing that right now the search engine, a powerful search engine, has a lot of clout. But still, you have the opportunity at least to click onto the second, third, or fourth page. So now with the ubiquity of voice, it might become it's lowering the friction, because with voice, you don't have to go then and search. You can just ask your assistant. And you're relying on your assistant to provide you something that would match your interests. So how do we know even if search degradation occurs? So interestingly enough, the European Commission now with its search degradation case, they says, well, there's the organic algorithm, and then we see what Google did, and we can compare to see what consumers would have gotten with the organic algorithm versus the degraded algorithm. Here, you're not going to even have that because you're going to have everything personalized for you. There may not be necessarily an organic algorithm. It's just going to be your personal algorithm. So how do you know then you're asking Amazon, what's the latest with Donald Trump? And you get a featured story from the Washington Post. Is that because the CEO owns the Washington Post? Is it because you find the Washington Post credible? And what happens once you start getting the Washington Post, you start relying on that, then you get the sort of feedback loop. To what extent is that going to narrow your viewpoints? So that's precisely the issue that we're raising, and that it's not only going to have economic implications, but also social and political implications.
Yeah. But if you apply that reasoning to goods and services, you will always consume the same stuff. I'm
going to be optimistic here because I'm jumping to tell you about one of my PhD students' studies. He actually looked into this, he ran a field test, and what he found was actually that extreme personalization and recommendations just is not an effective technique. And why is that? Well, if you're going to recommend something that someone's already done, they tend to just ignore it. The way to actually get people to react to communications is to do something novel. So hopefully, an optimistic viewpoint is that the algorithm will learn that people actually embrace novelty, and that means that they won't get stuck in the rut that you're worrying about.
I've got a loud voice, but I don't know what protocol is. I've got a question about distributional effects, I agree with Maurice. You have to look at both sides of the market, and I think that's an important thing. And I just would ask the question in terms of competition policy and antitrust policy. I mean, Canada has kind of a total welfare standard, but all other jurisdictions were consumer-centric. And when we start thinking about different sides of these markets, we're going to be aggregating across sides somehow. And I think about that in the context of your ad example. It strikes me that I've got a real beef here because as a male, I'm getting bombarded with way too many ads, right? So who's hurt is a function of which side of one of these biases you're on. I'm just asking the question, as an economist, we typically are pretty uncomfortable making these distributional questions. And so what is our role as economists or competition authorities or consumer protection authorities to talk about whether discrimination against men in the advertising targeting market is a bad thing or a good thing?
So I mean, one response, I mean, you're right. I mean, this raises really tough issues because let's say Google were to acquire Twitter, right? And let's say as a result of having that data, it could lower then the cost for advertisers, and advertisers benefit as a result. So there you have perhaps an economic benefit for advertisers. But let's say on the other hand that consumers' privacy protections might be adversely affected. And let's say that it might also promote, just for the sake of argument, behavioral discrimination. So then, is that the role of the competition official to say, and then also you have something that may not be readily measurable, just privacy overall, the privacy protection. So what then is the competition authority supposed to say? And let's say that you might even, to add to it, let's say like with Facebook WhatsApp was previously offered for a nominal fee. Let's actually assume that the price goes down to zero. How do you then measure all of that? And is that the job of the competition official? Because when you have short-term gains, and you might have losses that aren't measurable, isn't that going to then just factor in support then, let's just go with the short-term gains? And if you do that, are you necessarily going to get the right response from a welfare perspective? And I think one thing that we're coming to the realization in the United States is that the price-centric approach really is not objective, in that it only really captures maybe a small segment of what's going on in some of these industries. In some other industries, it might cover everything, but in other industries, it doesn't. And then if you try to say, well, I've got this and I can quantify this, so I'm going to give greater weight to that, and what I can't quantify, I'm just going to discount or ignore, that could then lead to a worse result overall. So, it's a tough issue that I think competition authorities need to grapple with.
Yeah. I mean, Michael, you notice that I chose an ad which people might care about. Usually being a marketing professor, everyone's like, well, we don't want any of that advertising, so we're happy it doesn't happen. But here I chose a particular instance where there might be useful information in the ad. Now, another way of taking your question, though, is really, is this kind of bias something that competition authorities should be grappling with, or is it something we should leave to the employment department? We've got housing discrimination laws. Should we actually put it, if we're worried about health discrimination, we've replicated this with health insurance products, should we just propose it in the bodies that are already handling discrimination? And we maybe should do, but that's, it's interesting, it's becoming a competition issue.
Amelia.
I was just going to raise a question about, again, personal data assistance, but whether actually there might be value in some quite strong consumer protection around them, but for themselves, in terms of alleviating consumers' concerns. So, for example, I was just trying to think of, at least in a space-age fantasy, the sorts of things that could happen that we might worry about. So, for example, my health insurance could potentially be affected by how many takeaways I eat. Now, Alexa's probably going to know about that. My car insurance might be affected by how much I sleep. How tired I am. Alexa's probably going to know a fair amount about that as well. And my credit score might be affected. Actually, it turns out your credit, one of the things that really impacts on your credit is if you get divorced. So Alexa will know how much I'm arguing with my husband, whether I'm having an affair, should that affect my credit score. I personally would really rather that Alexa wasn't sharing that kind of information with either credit scorers or insurers. And that might stop me getting Alexa in my house. If I could be absolutely promised that Alexa was not going to share that kind of information, I would be much more comfortable. So I just wondered whether you felt that kind of certain rules would really actually help Alexa really take off.
Right. I mean, well, it's going to come to consumer trust. But then the issue is, what we've heard in the past, and Google made this argument. It says, look, if we lose consumer trust, then people can go elsewhere, right? And that's what they argued. And one of the things that we did in our book is we looked at how many times Google has violated privacy policies. And that really hasn't stopped Google. In fact, Google, I think the FTC imposed for the first time a privacy compliance program in order to prevent it, and there were violations thereafter. So one thing is you might say, well, consumers don't really care about privacy. But when you look at the data, it seems to suggest that consumers do, that they are concerned about it, and it's the lack of choice and the lack of ability to choose others is of concern. So that could be then a facet of market power. And so what's then to prevent then Alexa from sharing that information with third parties? And that's precisely the issue. But even if Alexa doesn't share it with third parties, even if it just uses it internally for the own products that it sells and the like, that might give it also a competitive advantage. So what are the limitations then are going to be on Alexa on using that information internally? And these are, I mean, so one of the things that we were thinking about is like, would Alexa tell you that the results that it was providing you was sponsored? And might that make a difference? And the like. But no, these are really tough issues, precisely the way that you identify them.
So I think we are about out of time. Thank you very much again to our two wonderful speakers.